So just as an exercise in full disclosure, I'm not a woodworker. I dabble in woodworking because I enjoy it, but I'm not a woodworker. As such, I really haven't been able to justify spending hundreds of dollars on woodworking machines like planers or jointers for something that really just amounts to a hobby, right? I don't have a workshop, I don't really have a garage. All I have is a driveway to work in when I get time for stuff like this. So I was blessed when I ran across an offer on the internet from someone looking to give away a DeWalt planer. The gentleman said that someone had given it to him and had a damaged blade and roller. He said he thought if it was because someone had run through a board with a nail in it maybe. But being as cocky as I am and thinking that I can fix anything, I threw my name in the hat and drove out to meet him. When he pulled up, he apologized for getting some information incorrect and said that instead it was a Ridgid planer. Well, for the price I was paying for it, that really wasn't a point to argue and get upset about. It was the right price already, right? So I brought it home and began investigating the planer. First things first, I blew off all the sawdust out of it, and frankly I had to pry some of the sawdust out of certain places. Then I wiped down the smooth rods on the repeat-a-cut feature because that thing was very hard to move. Put some machine oil on the threaded rods that moved the spindle up and down, and put some machine oil on smooth rods I'd just cleaned, and put some paste wax on the infeed table and the outfeed table, and the table underneath the spindle. So it needed some cleaning, but again, given the price I'd paid for it, that really wasn't something that needed the manager to get involved, right? So the guy I got it from had taped the bent blade lock bar on top of the machine and had taped all the bolts that held that bar in it in a bundle. Just to make sure that it would work, and I turned on the planer, and it made a horrible rumbling sound, like vibrating. But I figured that was because there were supposed to be 3 blades and blade locks on the spindle, and at that point there were only 2 mounted, so it's probably just out of balance, or at least that was what I was thinking. I tried to find a blade lock bar online, and nobody had one. I emailed Ridgid twice and still haven't received even a peep back from them. Apparently there are others in my exact same situation, and because I found it's also because I found lots of comments on reviews and forums and various places on the internet. Even though Ridgid products are supposed to come with a lifetime warranty, so my only solution at this point was to try and take care of the situation myself. I had found someone else on the internet with the exact same planer and the same exact problem, and he stated that since the blade lock bar was just mild steel, that he simply hammered the lock bar into shape. So I started out trying that method. I wasn't able to hammer it back into shape, so then I got the idea that I could just clamp it in the vise and force it that way. When that wasn't working either, I had the bright idea to get a hammer and hammer the vise handle to force the lock bar to do my bidding. That was a bad idea. Don't do that, trust me. It will damage the threads in the vise. I found that out the hard way. So I finally got the vise to open back up and tried hammering again. This time the lock bar finally broke where it was originally bent. So much for that idea. Then someone on the woodworkingtalk.com forum suggested to someone else who was looking for the same exact part to just go to a machine shop and have them make it. So I figured I'd just make one myself. Shouldn't be too hard, right? Just some straight bar, ground to the right dimensions with a similar thickness and holes drilled in the right places. I thought it would be a pretty straightforward process. So I looked in my scrap pile. I found a piece of angle iron from what used to be a pop-up shelter that was the same thickness of steel from what I could tell, and went to work. First I cut it down the middle with a cutoff wheel on an angle grinder and ground the cut edge so I'd have a flat stock to work with. Then I rough cut the links using the factory lock bars that weren't bent as a guide. I cut 3 pieces so that I could make a full set, and the theory behind this was that if I used 3 bars that I made, they'd be of a similar weight to each other than would be if I made one and used it with the 2 good factory blade lock bars, right? I was worried that my homemade bars wouldn't be weighted like the factory bars and there might be an out of balance issue. I was wanting to try to avoid that if possible. So next I clamped down a factory bar on top of that piece, one of the pieces I just cut, so I could get a more precise hole placement when I drilled through the holes. After drilling the holes, I placed bolts through the factory piece and my homemade piece so they wouldn't slip, and proceeded to then grind down my homemade pieces, sneaking up to the dimensions of the factory piece. After that, I stacked all the homemade pieces together, again with bolts so they wouldn't slip and hold them in place, and made sure all the pieces were identical. or the pieces I just made anyways. Then I test fit the pieces, and some of the holes didn't quite line up like they should have. Fortunately, each of the 3 pieces I had made had at least 2 or 3 holes that did line up. So I set to work finding out how I needed to modify the holes that didn't line up correctly, and drug out the Dremel tool with a grinding stone and a needle file, and finally got one of the pieces I had made to line up. Being frustrated at this point and really wanting to actually plane something, I made the decision to just use one of my bars along with the 2 factory bars that weren't bent. Now, as I was looking over the planer on first inspection, I noticed that not all the bolts were the same that holds in the blade lock bars. A previous owner had obviously replaced some of these at some point with non-matching bolts, and some of the factory bolts had actually been cut to be able to remove them. I actually had to do the same thing for a bolt that I couldn't get out of one of the bars, and ended up also having to hammer a chisel on it to get the thing to turn and break loose. So in order that all the bolts match and that all the bolts are the same weight to help with the balancing issue, I went out and got new bolts from Lowe's. And while I was taking out the 2 remaining factory lock bars, I noticed that there were springs under each bolt on either end of each lock bar. Since the bent bar had already been removed before I got the planer, I needed to replace those as well. I couldn't find the exact spring I needed at Lowe's, but I found one with the same diameter, about the same wire size, and about the same springiness to it. Then I just cut it to match the length of the factory springs that I still had. I was picking the brain of a guy at church who does metal fabrication on the side, and when looking at the factory bar, he asked if I had a belt sander, and that he would advise that I cut that front bevel on the bar with the belt sander instead of trying to use the bench grinder. After getting home, I don't think this was the kind of belt sander he had in mind, but it works, right? So now I've got a bar that will actually bolt on with similar dimensions of the factory ones, and even though the front bevel wasn't exactly like the factory ones, I decided to go for it. I installed the 2 factory lock bars, my homemade lock bar, all new bolts, 21 of them to be exact, the blades, and the 2 new springs I'd made, along with the 4 factory springs. After making sure everything was good and snug, it was time to turn it on and see what would happen. Again, I'm not a woodworker and I've never owned a planer, but this seems like it worked. There was no sparks, no flames, nothing flew apart or made bad noises, and no one was injured or killed. That's a win in my book. I even ran a piece of pallet board through it and it planed it down. But allow me to show you what I'm really excited about planing on this thing. This is a piece of HDPE, or high density polyethylene, that I melted down from used milk jugs in my kitchen oven and clamped between 2 boards. I have an entire pile of these plastic boards, and being able to get these planed smooth and all the same thickness will really help me to make something awesome out of these things with minimal waste. So if you have any comments or suggestions, please let me know in the comments. I'm not a woodworker or a metal fabricator, so if there's something I could have done better, or if there's something that I did that will result in catastrophic consequences down the road, by all means, please give me a heads up in the comments. I'm just happy to finally have a planer. So the cost breakdown on all this. The planer was free, obviously. There were only 2 blades that were on it, so I ordered a 3 set off of Amazon, and I bought new bolts and springs. So all in all, for less than 50 bucks, I have a functioning planer. Well, I also bought a can of paste wax, and I had to buy a new drill bit set because I'm not a fabricator and I burned up the ones I had before watching some YouTube videos and learning that I was doing it wrong. But I don't count those costs in this project, A, because it was my stupidity that forced the need to buy new drill bits, and B, because the paste wax and the drill bits will be used in many other projects, not just this one. So yeah, I'm happy with how this turned out, especially for a part that no longer has any sort of replacement part that can be found from a company who refuses to reply to emails. I think it came out all right. But again, if you have any comments or suggestions, or if maybe I missed something, please let me know down in the comments below. Thank you for watching, have a great day, and God bless.